Good morning everyone! On this blessed day I attempt to make a rather professional looking table. This took me 2 months to make and I did pour a lot of effort into it. I first started off by removing all the bark from the tree. I was quite surprised to find about a dozen worms living between the bark and the tree itself, or maybe they're called grubs, I'm not sure. This tree was air dried for 6 years and a slab was cut by Sid just for me. Following that, I proceeded to oil the whole thing up. I covered it in a very generous amount of tung oil. I know tung oil is expensive and I probably should have used something else. But I had tung oil to spare, to be honest, since I got a lot on sale and I was afraid that the tung oil would be going bad. I don't know if it has an expiry or not. If you guys know, do please let me know because I have no idea. As soon as the wood started drinking oil, for the next 3 days, a lot of insects started coming out of every conceivable hole in the table. Everything from wood lice to bark centipedes. They were far too many to count. I was quite baffled by just how many were living in there. It was a huge lively stock. Once insects stopped coming out, I took the wood indoors and let it dry for 7 weeks. After 7 weeks, I checked moisture content and it was a nice 7%. So now that I decided it was dry enough, I finally got to use my sled. This is first time I used it and it shows. I was very scared and nervous at first. Main reason was because while drying, the wood warped ever so slightly. Nothing overly obvious, but there was an 1/8 of an inch of difference from one corner to the diagonal opposite corner of the slab. I called a few places to get it drum sanded in my area, and in general everything is just horrible when it comes to getting things drum sanded. I feel very jealous of Blacktail Studios regarding that. That's why I had to create this router sled. Overall, I do have to say I like my sled and the piece ended up surprisingly straight. For the bottom, as you saw, I made a small mistake of not properly securing the depth gauge on a router, so it went a little bit lower. So overall, I did lose almost 1/4 of an inch of thickness by passing the table through the sled. One of the things GoPro simply failed to record is me cutting ends of the table off in order to make a 45-degree miter cuts with my track saw, so I apologize for not showing that part. I had to cut it to length to fit my sled. Once the piece was nice and smooth, however, it was time to fix up some imperfections. So I just added glue to all the holes that looked bad, covered it up in a really generous amount of sawdust from the pieces of the ends I cut off earlier and massaged it in. I let it dry for 2 days per side, and then I used the 60 grit sandpaper to properly sand any excess glue off in order to give it a perfectly natural look. Having finished that, I found corners to be too sharp looking and didn't like that, so I used one of my epoxy cups to draw out a natural looking curve. Then I set my jigsaw at a 45 degree to match the mitre I cut previously, and I proceeded to cut those edges nice and round. Do let me know what you would have preferred more, a sharper looking corner or a rounded corners I used. I'm curious what you guys prefer, and who knows, maybe I will do what you suggested for the next table I make, which won't be until next summer, so you have a lot of time to tell me your thoughts. Now that the corners were ready, I began the most zen part of this build, sanding. I started off with 80 grit and used it to make sure that absolutely every single corner and piece of the wood was nice and rounded without a single edge against which you might feel pressure. Following that, I proceeded to 100 and 120 grit, making sure to accentuate every single curve of the wood. After 120 grit, I noticed that the imperfections on my workbench would leave some of the scratches on the tabletop I was sanding, so I decided to cover the whole thing up in a nice and soft blanket. This made moving the piece a whole lot more easier and alleviated any fear I might have of leaving a scratch on the table while I was sliding it around or flipping it. As I was sanding it, I felt like the top was telling me its life story. You could see in the middle there is a scar. Seems that when the tree was young, it had a branch and someone snapped it off, thus leaving a scar. You could also see the growing pains it went through in some places due to the pressure that was resting on top of it. I was both sanding and reading the tails of the tree. Between each sanding, I made sure to thoroughly remove all of the sawdust residue that would have been left over because I didn't want it to go in the air and I didn't want the blanket to get too ruined. And slowly, by sanding very carefully, I hit 2000 grit and the whole thing was starting to look very, very shiny. But it wasn't shiny enough. I had sandpaper going all the way up to 4000 grit, so sanding all the way up to 4000 I did. Got to say, the whole process felt absolutely amazing. When I was done, I took the top home, propped it up near the TV, and I could actually see TV inside the wood because it became very reflective. Anything past 4000 grit would require a special substance, so I stopped at 4000. But I bet if I went past 4000, I would have ended up with a nice metallic finish. I so wish Festool made sandpaper that went past 4000. If you guys do happen to know of any paper that goes past 4000, please let me know so I can obtain it. I would really love to make a piece that's, let's say, 12,000 grit. That would be absolutely amazing. So bottom was sanded to 800 grit and top to 4000 grit. It was time to oil this baby up. I started off with bottom at first by using application pad. I know it is a bit coarse, but this was the bottom and only sanded to 800, so application pad was fine to use. Using normal oil wouldn't have worked since I sanded it too high, but Odys actually works surprisingly well enough. If you guys know of any other finishes I can apply to a piece sanded to 4000 grit, please let me know. I used a lot of force and quick movements to get it in, let it dry for 8 hours, wipe excess off and apply another layer. And by doing so, I applied a total of 3 layers to the bottom and 4 layers to the top. For the top, I used the cotton rag because I was too afraid of application pad causing any scratches on my 4000 grit top. Once I was done, I let the whole thing rest for 2 days facing up. And at the same time, I questioned my life choices as to why I didn't raise my workbench so I didn't have to bend down, because by this point my back was really hurting. And then it was time to wax it. Again, I used Odys wax here. I applied overly generous amount of wax, set sander to the highest speed, and then proceeded to very slowly apply wax using a cotton buffer, making sure that all of the friction created enough heat to bind the wax to the table. But I did use a little bit too much wax. When I was done, my legs were completely covered in the wax. Not that I minded since it feels and smells amazing, but it is a waste and something to keep in mind for the future, not to mention Odys wax is prohibitively expensive sometimes. Now that everything was done, it was time to install legs. First, I drilled pilot holes that I would be using for my threaded inserts. I put a piece of tape on a drill bit in order to make sure that I do not drill in too deep, since the table was only 1¼ inches thick and I didn't want to poke a hole on the other side. Once pilot hole was drilled, I applied a lot of super glue to the threaded insert and installed it. Applying super glue isn't necessary, but it does ensure that the insert binds to the wood better. And then it was a simple act of just installing the legs by screwing the bolts in. That's it, the table was ready. Overall, I was very happy with how it turned out and how it looked. It is probably the first piece of wood I made that to me felt very professionally done. And in general, there aren't many problems I encountered with this piece. It was a joy to work with from start to finish. However, I would like your comments, please. Do let me know where you think I could have improved and if the piece made sense and if it was good enough or not. I would appreciate your feedback and promise to use it on my next table build this upcoming summer. If you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it, please consider subscribing and maybe leaving a like. I try to release videos every week. If you have any comments or just want to say hi, that's also very welcome. I promise to say hi back. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you next week. Bye bye!